The massive doors of the Galactic Culinary Institute slid open with a soft hiss, and Lee Minho stepped inside carrying 3 heavy bags that immediately set off every security alarm in the building. The young Korean chef from Earth looked around, in wonder at the gleaming white halls and floating platforms where alien students glided between classes. He had dreamed of this moment for years, being the first human ever accepted into the most prestigious cooking school in the galaxy. Chef instructor Veltara approached him with careful steps. She was an Alterian, tall and elegant with skin that looked like polished silver and dozens of tiny crystal formations around her head that sparkled when she moved. These crystals were her sensory organs, far more sensitive than human noses or tongues. She had fought hard to get the Institute's board to approve Minho's application, believing that cultural exchange through food could bring species together. "Welcome, student Minho," she said in perfect Korean, her voice like soft chimes. "We are honored to have you join us." Minho bowed politely and grinned. "Thank you so much for this chance. I brought some ingredients from home to share with everyone. I want to show them real Korean cooking." The security guards were still waving their scanners over his bags, their devices beeping and flashing red warnings. One guard, a bug-like Trilaxian with compound eyes, looked concerned as he read his screen. "Sir, we're detecting unknown chemical compounds. Some of these readings are unusual." Minho laughed and unzipped his first bag. "Oh, that's probably just my gochujang and kimchi. They're fermented so they might smell strong to your machines." He pulled out a large red container that made several nearby students take a step back. The other students in the hallway were an interesting mix. Most were Filari, peaceful plant eaters who looked like tall, graceful deer with soft blue fur and large, gentle eyes. They communicated in musical tones and lived on a diet of sweet fruits and mild vegetables. Next to them stood a group of Quinari, who looked almost like living jellyfish with translucent bodies and flowing tentacles. They fed by filtering nutrients from water and had never encountered anything stronger than lightly seasoned algae. As Minho continued unpacking, he pulled out containers labeled with Korean text. "I've got some dried ghost pepper flakes here for when we want to add real heat to a dish," he said cheerfully, holding up a small jar of innocent-looking red powder. "And this is my special kimchi that my grandmother taught me to make. It's been fermenting for 6 months." The translation system in the hallway started making confused sounds as it tried to process his words. The computer couldn't understand why someone would voluntarily eat something called a ghost pepper, or why fermentation, which usually meant spoiled food to most species, was considered desirable. Veltara's crystal sensory organs began to dim slightly, which was a sign of stress in her species. She had studied human culture extensively before approving Minho's application, but she was starting to realize there might be gaps in her research. "Student Minho," she said carefully, "when you say mild Korean street food for your introduction class tomorrow, what exactly do you mean by mild?" Minho's eyes lit up with excitement. "Oh, nothing too crazy for the first day. I was thinking maybe some simple tteokbokki, that's rice cakes in a sweet and spicy sauce. Very basic stuff. Maybe some Korean fried chicken with just a little bit of seasoning. And definitely some kimchi jjigae soup. That's like comfort food for us, super gentle and warming." A small Filari student nearby began to tremble. Her translator had picked up the word spicy and cross-referenced it with the security scanner readings from Minho's bags. The results were terrifying. The security guard was still studying his readings with growing alarm. "Chef instructor, these chemical signatures are unlike anything in our database. Some of these compounds are registering as potential irritants or defensive chemicals." Minho overheard and looked confused. "Defensive chemicals? It's just food. My little sister eats this stuff every day and she's only 12. This statement made things worse. If human children consumed these substances regularly, what did that say about human biology? Veltara began to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake, but it was too late now. The introduction class was scheduled for tomorrow, and students from 17 different species had signed up to experience authentic human cuisine for the first time. As Minho headed toward his assigned dormitory, still chatting excitedly about his plans for tomorrow's class, the other students watched him go with a mixture of curiosity and terror. None of them had any idea they were about to witness the most legendary disaster in the Institute's 3,000-year history. The next morning, Minho walked into Classroom 7 with a spring in his step and his arms full of ingredients. The cooking stations were arranged in a circle, with each student having their own prep area and cooking surface. 17 different species had gathered to watch the human demonstrate his home cooking, their various eyes, sensors, and tentacles, all focused on him with curiosity. "Good morning, everyone," Minho called out cheerfully as he began setting up his station. "Today I'm going to show you how to make some really basic Korean dishes. Nothing fancy, just the kind of food I grew up eating." He pulled out a large container of kimchi that had been fermenting for months. The moment he popped open the lid, the classroom's atmosphere changed dramatically. The fermented cabbage released a complex mix of gases that had never been detected in the Institute's sterile environment before. 3 Quinari students, whose jellyfish-like bodies were incredibly sensitive to chemical changes in the air, immediately began to convulse. Their translucent forms started flashing warning colors as their filtering systems went into overdrive trying to process the unfamiliar compounds. Within seconds, all 3 had collapsed onto the floor, their tentacles twitching, as medical alerts began sounding from their personal health monitors. "Oh no, are they okay?" Minho asked, genuinely concerned as he rushed toward the fallen students. Chef Instructor Veltara's crystal sensory organs were flashing rapidly, a sign of extreme distress. "Stay back, Student Minho. Don't bring that container any closer." But the kimchi was just the beginning. As Minho returned to his station and began pulling out more ingredients, the situation got worse. He casually chopped up fresh garlic and ginger, the pungent oils filling the air. The Falari students, with their incredibly sensitive plant-based biology, began showing signs of severe distress. Their soft blue fur started falling out in clumps, a stress response their species had developed over millions of years of evolution. One young Falari named Seolhee began making high-pitched musical sounds that the translator identified as distress calls. Another student's large, gentle eyes were streaming with what looked like tears, though it was actually a protective fluid their species produced when exposed to harmful chemicals. "I'm just making bulgogi marinade," Minho explained, completely unaware of the chaos he was causing. "It's really simple. Just soy sauce, a little sugar, some sesame oil." He began mixing the ingredients in a large bowl, his movements confident and practiced. The classroom's air filtration system was working overtime, but it couldn't keep up with the complex mixture of volatile compounds Minho was releasing. Warning lights began flashing as the building's automated systems detected what they classified as a potential chemical weapon deployment. Then Minho reached for a small container of gochugaru, Korean red pepper flakes. "Now I'll just add a tiny bit of this for color and flavor," he said, sprinkling what looked like a few pinches of red powder into his marinade. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The capsaicin in the pepper flakes, even in such a small amount, triggered emergency protocols throughout the building. The Falari students who were still conscious began fleeing toward the exits, their musical distress calls echoing through the halls. Several Altarian students, whose crystal sensory organs were even more sensitive than Veltara's, began emitting high-frequency sounds that shattered 3 glass containers in the adjacent laboratory. Emergency evacuation alarms started, blaring throughout the institute. Students from other classrooms began evacuating the building, thinking there had been a chemical spill or terrorist attack. The automatic blast doors began sealing off Classroom 7 to contain what the computer systems had identified as a hazardous substance release. Through all of this chaos, Minho remained completely oblivious. He dipped a small spoon into his bulgogi marinade, tasted it thoughtfully, and made a face. This is pretty bland," he muttered to himself, completely ignoring the sirens and flashing lights around him. "It needs more heat." Veltara watched in absolute horror as the human reached for a bottle that was labeled in Korean characters. Her translation implant identified it as something called Korean fire sauce. The ingredients list made her crystal, organs dim to almost nothing as her body tried to protect itself from even the thought of such concentrated capsaicin. Minho unscrewed the cap and poured a generous amount into his marinade, then stirred it casually with his bare hands. The fumes, rising from the bowl, were now registering on sensors 3 floors away. He dipped his spoon in again, tasted it, and smiled with satisfaction. Perfect. Now that's got some flavor, he said happily, completely unaware that he had just consumed what most galactic species would classify as industrial solvent. His human biology, evolved over thousands of years of eating plants that fought back with chemical warfare, processed the extreme heat as nothing more than a pleasant tingle. The medical emergency teams were already suiting up in hazmat gear in the basement, preparing to enter what they assumed was a contaminated zone. None of them had any idea they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a chemical spill. They were dealing with human comfort food. 20 minutes after the alarm started blaring, the emergency response team burst through the sealed doors of Classroom 7, wearing full hazmat suits. Their equipment looked like something from a space movie: thick white protective clothing, breathing apparatus, and scanners that beeped constantly as they swept the room for dangerous chemicals. The team leader, Dr. Quintel, was a tall, insect-like being with multiple eyes and antennae that twitched nervously as he approached Minho's cooking station. His species, the Vexari, were known throughout the galaxy for their scientific expertise and careful approach to dangerous situations. Right now, his scanners were going absolutely crazy. "Student Minho," Dr. Quintel's voice came through his suit's speakers with a mechanical buzz. "Please step away from your cooking materials immediately. We're reading chemical signatures that register as Class 2 hazardous substances." Minho looked up from his bulgogi marinade, completely confused. He was still stirring it with his bare hands, the Korean fire sauce creating a rich red color that he found quite appealing. Around him, the emergency team was setting up containment equipment and taking air samples like they were dealing with a nuclear accident. "Hazardous substances?" Minho asked, genuinely puzzled. "It's just bulgogi marinade. My mom makes this every Sunday for family dinner. My little nephew Jihoon loves it, and he's only 8 years old." The mention of a human child regularly consuming these compounds made Dr. Quintel's antennae quiver with concern. He checked his readings again, certain there must be some mistake. But no, the capsaicin levels were off the charts, the fermented compounds from the kimchi were unlike anything in their database, and the garlic concentration alone would require a permit to transport on most civilized worlds. "Sir, we understand. This may be normal for your species," Dr. Quintel said carefully. "But what you consider mild seasoning is registering readings that would require hazmat protocols on 47 different planets. The capsaicin concentration in that sauce you added would be classified as a chemical weapon on 12 worlds and requires industrial safety permits on 23 others." Minho blinked in surprise. He had no idea that his grandmother's cooking could be considered dangerous. Looking around at the chaos he had apparently caused, the unconscious Quinari students being carried out on stretchers, the Falari students who had lost patches of fur, the emergency crews in full protective gear, he felt terrible. "Oh wow, I'm really sorry," he said, setting down his spoon. "I had no idea. Look, let me make something really bland instead. How about my grandmother's gentle kimchi jjigae? It's super mild. She made it for me when I was sick as a kid. It's basically just a comfort soup." The medical team exchanged worried glances through their helmet visors. Dr. Quintel was about to explain that anything involving kimchi would probably make things worse, but Minho was already reaching for new ingredients with enthusiasm. "This will be perfect," Minho said happily, pulling out a fresh container of aged kimchi that immediately made the air quality sensors spike again. "Just some soft tofu, a little pork, and barely any seasoning at all." The hazmat team watched, in fascination and horror as Minho began his gentle soup preparation. He started by heating oil in a large pot, then added what he considered just a small amount of kimchi. The fermented cabbage hit the hot oil and released a cloud of steam that made the emergency equipment start beeping frantically. "This is completely harmless," Minho explained as he added chunks of pork and began browning them with the kimchi. "Korean grandmothers feed this to babies when they're teething." Dr. Quintel was frantically taking notes on his scanner. The idea that human infants consumed these compounds regularly was revolutionary and terrifying, From a xenobiological perspective, it suggested that human pain tolerance and chemical resistance were far beyond what anyone had imagined. Minho continued cooking, adding what he called just a tiny splash of fish sauce that made 3 hazmat team members take a step back. Then came soy sauce, a little sugar, and what he insisted was barely any gochujang, Korean chili paste that his scanner identified as concentrated capsaicin with a complexity rating that broke their measurement system. "There," Minho said proudly, ladling some of the soup into a bowl. "This is as mild as Korean food gets. Want to try some?" The offer sent the medical team into a panic. Dr. Quintel quickly activated his emergency communicator, calling the institute's director and the local medical authorities. Within minutes, the entire building was under quarantine protocols. "Student Minho," Dr. Quintel said gently, "I think we need to have a serious conversation about interspecies food safety. What you've just prepared would require signed medical waivers and supervision from 3 different specialists for any non-human to even smell, let alone taste." Minho looked down at his soup, which was bubbling peacefully and smelled like home to him. He couldn't understand how something his sick grandmother had fed him could be considered dangerous enough to shut down an entire culinary institute. "But it's just soup," he said quietly, finally beginning to realize that being human in a galaxy full of more delicate species was going to be more complicated than he had ever imagined. Over the next few days, the institute's medical bay looked like a war zone. 17 students from different species were recovering from what the medical reports officially called severe olfactory and gustatory system shock due to exposure to human culinary compounds. The Quinari students were slowly regaining their natural translucent color after turning a sickly green, while the Filari were being treated with special fur regrowth therapy after their stress-induced shedding. But something strange was happening. In the research department, Dr. Quintel, who should have been writing up safety violations and recommending Minho's immediate expulsion, found himself absolutely fascinated by what he had witnessed. He had never seen a biological system that could not only tolerate but actually enjoy such extreme chemical compounds. "This is remarkable," he muttered to himself as he studied the readings from Minho's cooking session. The human showed no signs of distress, no elevated heart rate, no defensive responses. He actually seemed to find pleasure in consuming substances that would kill most known species. Word spread quickly through the Institute's faculty. Professor Yelnara, an ancient crystalline who had studied comparative biology for over 3 centuries, requested permission to observe Minho under controlled conditions. Dr. Silvera, the Institute's leading expert on evolutionary cuisine, wanted to understand how a species could develop such extreme taste preferences. Within a week, Minho found himself in a specialized laboratory surrounded by curious scientists, all wearing protective gear and studying him like he was some kind of fascinating alien creature, which, from their perspective, he absolutely was. "Student Minho," Dr. Quintel began carefully, "we would like to conduct some experiments with your permission. We want to understand how your species can consume these compounds safely." Minho, who had spent the last few days feeling terrible about hospitalizing his classmates, was eager to help. "Of course. I want to understand this too. I had no idea. My food was so intense for everyone else." The first experiment was simple. Dr. Quintel presented Minho with a series of progressively spicier samples, each one carefully measured and analyzed. What they discovered amazed them. Humans had apparently evolved alongside plants that were engaged in an evolutionary arms race, with each generation of plants developing stronger chemical defenses and each generation of humans developing better tolerance for those defenses. "Your species essentially turned plant warfare into cuisine," Professor Yelnara observed with something that sounded like admiration. "Remarkable adaptation." Dr. Silvera was taking detailed notes on everything. The capsaicin compounds that cause other species severe pain actually trigger pleasure responses in human neurology. "It's like your species evolved to enjoy being chemically attacked." Minho laughed at that description. "I never thought of it that way, but I guess that makes sense. My grandmother always said that good food should have some bite to it." As the research continued, Minho became increasingly fascinated by the challenge this presented. If he was going to stay at the Institute and learn from alien cuisines, he needed to figure out how to make his food safe for his classmates. It became like a puzzle that consumed all his free time. What if I could create versions of Korean food that other species could actually eat? He wondered aloud during one of his research sessions. Dr. Quintel looked up from his scanner readings. What do you mean? Well, what if I took my recipes and reduced everything by huge amounts, like, instead of a tablespoon of gochujang, what if I used just a few molecules? Could I create training versions of Korean food? The idea intrigued the research team. Working together, they began developing what Minho called alien-safe Korean cuisine. It was incredibly challenging work. They had to reduce spice levels by factors of thousands while still maintaining some resemblance to the original flavors. Minho's first attempt at training kimchi used fermented cabbage with spice levels reduced by a factor of 5,000. Even at that incredibly low concentration, it still required medical supervision for non-human consumption. 3 volunteer faculty members tried microscopic samples under careful monitoring, and 2 of them still needed mild pain medication afterward. This is harder than I thought, Minho admitted as he worked on his 10th version of ultra-mild bulgogi marinade. How do you make something taste like Korean food when you remove almost everything that makes it Korean? Dr. Silvera had an idea. What if we approach this differently? Instead of reducing your recipes, what if we study the flavor compounds that don't cause distress and build from there? This approach proved more successful. They discovered that certain umami compounds from fermented soybeans could be tolerated in very small amounts. Some of the sweeter elements of Korean cuisine, like the rice syrup used in certain dishes, were completely safe for most species. Slowly, Minho began developing a new category of cuisine, Korean-inspired dishes that could be shared across species. His universal kimchi contained no capsaicin at all, but used carefully selected fermentation byproducts to create a similar tangy flavor. His galaxy-safe bulgogi used fruit enzymes instead of traditional marinades to create tender meat with a hint of sweetness. The work was painstaking and often frustrating, but Minho found himself more motivated than ever. He wasn't just learning to cook for aliens. He was pioneering an entirely new field of interspecies cuisine. And maybe, just maybe, he could help bring different species together through food, even if it meant completely reimagining everything he thought he knew about cooking. 8 months of intensive research, countless failed experiments, and dozens of hospitalized taste testers later, Lee Minho stood in the Institute's main auditorium preparing for his final examination. The room was packed with faculty members, students, and even some dignitaries from various planetary governments who had heard about the remarkable human who was revolutionizing interspecies cuisine. His thesis project sat on the examination table, a thick document titled Cross-Species Flavor Adaptation, Creating Universal Cuisine Through Molecular Reduction and Biochemical Safety Protocols. Next to it was an entire laboratory setup with specialized containment equipment, medical monitoring devices, and emergency response systems that had cost the Institute more than some starships. The safety protocols alone are longer than most doctoral dissertations, Professor Yelnara commented, as she flipped through the 23 different emergency procedures Minho had developed. Each protocol covered different species reactions, from Canary respiratory distress to Filari fur loss syndrome, to Alterian crystal overload. Minho had spent months perfecting what he called his universal Korean menu, dishes that maintained the essence of Korean flavors while being safe for consumption across dozens of different alien species. His bibimbap recipe, for instance, used rice that had been specifically grown in soil with reduced mineral content, vegetables that were blanched multiple times to remove natural compounds, and a sauce that contained exactly 47 molecules of gochujang per serving. The final exam began with Minho preparing his extremely mild bibimbap for a panel of judges that included representatives from 12 different species. He moved with the precision of a surgeon, measuring each ingredient with scientific equipment rather than traditional cooking methods. Every component had been tested, retested, and approved by medical boards. This bibimbap contains less than 0.01% of the spice levels found in traditional Korean recipes, Minho explained as he carefully assembled the dish. The fermented elements have been reduced by a factor of 10,000, and all capsaicin has been removed and replaced with synthesized flavor compounds that provide similar taste without the chemical burn. The judges watched nervously as he placed small portions in front of each of them. The human members of the examination board, visiting professors from Earth, smiled at what looked like the blandest Korean food ever created. To them, it barely registered as seasoned at all. But for the alien judges, even this incredibly mild version was an adventure. The Filari cultural attaché, Ambassador Jae-min, took a careful bite and immediately began showing signs of distress. Despite all the precautions, despite months of testing, his species' sensitivity to fermented compounds was apparently higher than anyone had realized. Within minutes, Ambassador Jae-min was on the floor, his fur standing on end and his large eyes watering profusely. The medical team rushed in with emergency treatments for capsaicin poisoning, even though the dish technically contained no capsaicin at all. Apparently, the synthesized flavor compounds were close enough to trigger the same biological responses. Well, Dr. Quintel said dryly as the medical team worked, at least we know our emergency protocols work perfectly, despite the diplomatic incident, which required formal apologies to 3 different planetary governments. Minho passed his examination with the highest honors in the Institute's history. His work had created an entirely new field of culinary science that would be studied for centuries to come. 6 months after graduation, Minho opened his restaurant on Nexus Station, the galaxy's largest spaceport. Minho's Deathworld kitchen became an instant sensation. Though not quite in the way he had expected, the restaurant had 5 different dining levels, each with progressively more intense versions of Korean cuisine. Level 1 served his ultra-safe universal dishes that most species could enjoy together. Level 5 served actual Earth-standard Korean food, but only to humans and the handful of other species crazy enough to sign the extensive medical waivers. The most popular attraction was Level 3, where brave aliens could experience medium-intensity Korean food under medical supervision. Customers had to pass health screenings, sign liability waivers, and dine with emergency medical technicians standing by. Reservations were booked solid for 3 years in advance. Minho found the whole situation both hilarious and bewildering. He would watch alien food critics describing his Level 2 kimchi, which to him tasted like barely flavored cabbage, as an intense sensory experience that pushes the boundaries of what civilized beings can endure. But the biggest surprise came when he decided to add dessert to the menu. His grandmother's hotdeok recipe, which he considered a simple sweet pancake, caused the first recorded cases of acute sugar shock in 3 different species. Apparently, human tolerance for sweetness was just as extreme as their tolerance for spice. The crystalline food critic who reviewed his hotdog described it as like consuming liquid starlight, beautiful, transcendent, and potentially fatal. She had to be hospitalized for 2 days after eating half of one small pancake. Minho never quite understood why his comfort food had become the galaxy's most dangerous cuisine. But he had found his calling. He was no longer just a chef. He was a pioneer, an explorer pushing the boundaries of what was possible when different species tried to share a meal together. And somehow that felt exactly right.